Regarding our next presentation, a lot has been talked about over the past few years on club finances. Obviously, we've experienced the effects of COVID-19, and more recently the effects of inflation and a potential recession. And these issues may affect fiscal decisions at our member clubs in relation to budgets, dues, inflation fees, and capital improvement projects. Our partner and sponsor of today's meeting, Club Benchmarking, is here to provide an update on what clubs need to know and should be planning for as we enter into budget season for many clubs. Club Benchmarking is well known in the club community, and we are delighted that Ken Butler is able to join us this morning. Club Benchmarking's mission is to foster healthier clubs, empower managers, and establish strategic boards by elevating fact over opinion, and Ken is here to discuss key insights from years of benchmarking and analysis and research. Ken Butler is the Executive Director and Club Benchmarking's partner for clubs in the Mid-Atlantic region. As an experienced private club professional and former restaurant owner. A recognized leader in the hospitality and private club industries, he is certified by the Club Management Association of America and a member of the association's prestigious Honor Society. During his club management career, Ken built a track record of success in design, development, and implementation of dynamic capital improvement programs. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ken Butler of Club Benchmarking.
Is that working? Okay, very good. All right, so good morning, everyone. It's nice to be here. I want to thank the board of directors, of course, the management team here from Glen Oaks for hosting this. It's a great venue. You're certainly going to have a great afternoon of golf, and you're in for a treat, I'm sure. So we're here a lot, and I'm going to share with you some insights that we've learned over the last couple of years that might be new to some, might not be others. There's a lot of familiar faces in the room. So possibly you've heard some of these things, but we'll get into it. As was just mentioned, I'm a former general manager and a former restaurant owner, so there's nothing you can do to aggravate me, as I've been through the ringer there. But at any rate, I've been with Club Benchmarking for the last 4 years, and I've had the privilege to meet and visit with a lot of the clubs that are in the room here. I'm responsible for clubs on Long Island, New York City, and North Jersey as it relates to NGA, and then my associate, Chris Barrett, handles everything as part of NGA as north of New York City. So many of you have met Chris and know him pretty well. Chris is on assignment in Canada today, so he couldn't join me. So at any rate, we've been out there in the field since 2009 studying the financial data of clubs, and really what makes the club business model tick, and we've learned a lot of things about that over the years. And I'm not going to go back into everything that we've learned, but I will go through a quick review of some of those things. One of those is that the club industry is a fragmented cottage industry, really. It's the best practices, especially in the fundamental financial practices, are pretty consistent from club to club, and it's by rote for the most part, because best practices don't travel very quickly, if at all, in our industry. But there is some, from a fundamental financial model standpoint, it's very, very, I would say, very consistent over club type to club type, or even region to region, city to city. But we have learned that having a constantly evolving, clear vision for the club from a governance standpoint is vitally important. And some of the things we're going to talk about today revolve around what does your club's footprint have to say about things such as operating dues and in your capital footprint. And we've learned a lot that what the footprint dictates here at the club has a lot more to say about what it costs to be a member of the club ultimately, and at a high degree of accuracy. And all these things can be predicted just by looking at your financial picture. We have talked about, and you've probably seen this slide before, I'll just pop it up here real quick, that our industry still separates itself out into 3 distinct categories. We call them buckets, you can call them whatever you want, but 25% of our industry is really declining and not moving forward, and a lot of reasons for that. But one of the things that we've learned there is that the bulk of their members of the clubs that are failing tend to think more like customers than they do as stewards of the club. And it's kind of interesting because these clubs are they have the fewest members and need the most members, and they have fairly weak balance sheets. And we're sure that from a footprint perspective and from a budgeting perspective that there's a strong focus on operations as a financial driver. And as you'll see later, that's not necessarily the whole picture to be looking at. Whereas over on the far right there, the green bucket clubs tend to be clubs that are growing with purpose. They have stronger balance sheets. They have an evolving and growing membership. They do have a nice balance between what's necessary for the operation versus what's necessary for the capital side. And so those clubs have the most members. They have the highest initiation fees. These clubs are actually competing on the value that they provide, not necessarily on the price that they are in the market, whereas the red buckets, it tends to be more of a price competition there. And of course, 50% of our industry right there in the middle, somewhere in between. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the future, and when you look at it from a budget perspective, this is going to be a really high-level discussion and relatively fast-moving, with some opportunities at the end for some questions, but also some interactions beyond this meeting with anybody in the room that would like to get some information that we can put together for you with, I call it no blood. In other words, it's free. And so this chart here is just looking at the future from a demographic standpoint in terms of birth rate. We know that over the last 30 years, the average age of a new member of a club, of all clubs, is about 42 years old. It's been that for years, 30 years, and it's still that way today. The blue curve that you see on this chart here are people ages 37 to 47. And as you can see, when you get about 3 columns in, you're in 2024, and as you move up towards the middle of the chart, you see that blue line growing pretty extensively. So we believe that, especially for clubs with golf, that there's a potential tailwind for people interested in joining clubs. Because there's going to be a growing number of people in that clubbable age, that age between 37 and 47. The gold line you see there is the corresponding age group of member of people between 55 and 65. As you can see, from 2024, which, like I said, is 3 charts in from the left there. That's falling precipitously through the 2030, and then it starts to climb up again. So there's a couple things that come across us from a vision standpoint at a club. You have a growing number of people joining the club or interested in joining the club that are in that mid-40s range. And you have a declining number of people getting that 55 to 65, they're probably already at the club. And if you haven't noticed, there's probably some diametric opposition between your more tenured members and those newest members that have joined within the last 4 or 5 years. And I don't say that with certainty, but I'm pretty sure that you've seen that. And so that creates some tension. And that tension is the tension of opposites ultimately. So when you're talking about operating budgeting or even capital budgeting, there's that tension of opposites that's going to come from, we're very satisfied with the club, we don't need to invest more in the club is good the way it is, versus newer folks or people that have been in the club for only in the last couple of years are pushing forward and saying, hey, we want the newest things. We want we want to see our experience evolve beyond where it is today with aspirational needs, things of that nature. So when we talk about the money that it takes to run a club, and we're talking about the tension of opposites here, we like to split it up into 2 stanzas. The first stanza being on the operating side, and that's having enough operating money. It's operating dues, that's food and beverage sales, that's cart fees, that's greens fees, anything that members and guests are using to access the club. But there's enough of that that makes the club experience so compelling that you continually have enough members, and there's always pressure for more members coming in, and hopefully you have a wait list. If you go back before the pandemic, about 25% of clubs in our database had a wait list. Since the pandemic, as of today, it's about 49%. And that's of the clubs that we know of that we have access to either through GuideStar or in our own database, which is over 3,000 clubs at this point. And so that operating money is necessary to deliver that experience. We're going to get into that in just a second. But then the second stanza here is on the capital side, and that's always having enough capital cash flow to maintain your obligatory capital. And we coined this term a number of years ago, or Ray Cronin did actually, and that's the things that you already own. That's the furniture, fixtures, and equipment, and golf courses, and everything associated with the club, including those non-sexy items like air conditioning and boilers and all those things. That's obligatory capital. And that the club always has enough to maintain itself, and that the club probably has a quantified method for understanding what those needs are going forward, either in the way of an asset evaluation or some other tool that gives you insights on that can look at as far as 20 years, hopefully. Also, from a capital standpoint, is the aspirational capital. And those are the things that you're going to add to the club over time. I mean, 6 years ago, not many of us were talking about pickleball very much, right? So, I mean, there's always going to be something on the horizon. Now it's padel, and there's going to be other things that come up. And so, always having a plan in place to cover those aspirations is going to be very important. Some of those aspirations might be completely changing an area of the club that maybe used to be a banquet area, but now it needs to be something associated for families, youth and family, whatever the case may be. The idea is to have a plan that's generating enough capital to satisfy both the obligatory and the aspirational needs. And of course, the payment of debt falls under the obligatory side as well. So the tension of opposites comes when we think about it in terms of the vision. You know, what is the vision of the club? Does everybody know what the vision of the club is? And let's look at it from a 5-year standpoint. Does everybody in the membership, or at least the governance group, have an idea of what the club's going to look like 5 years from now, so that you can accurately articulate that to the members to get them excited about the future? And from a budgetary standpoint, are we budgeting to the vision, or are we doing something else? Or are we saying, this is our vision, but we can only afford this year, so we're actually jamming the vision down into a small budget maybe? And so both of those things occur across the spectrum of the red, yellow, and green bucket clubs. Okay? And so when we talk about this, we're going to shift gears and talk about it from a footprint standpoint. But before we do that, let's just talk about the member money over time. What we've learned, and on the average, say 20 years, which is an average age of a member life. Membership life, not a person's life. So of the 100% of the money that they'll put in throughout their member life, about 85% of that has flowed through the operating statement, or through the operation of the club. Which in most cases, most clubs in this room are probably operating darn near break even on the operation side, right? And 15% of that member money over time has gone to the capital side, all right? And so there's a number of things that we've learned there. On the operating side, if there's not enough operating cash flow, potentially then that membership experience will start to decline or be limited some way, somehow, from a cost-cutting standpoint or a cost containment standpoint, that you have to give up something in the operation to be able to do that. And we've already learned, and we know that from a financial standpoint, the operating statement as a break-even is the vehicle for providing a membership experience, and it doesn't necessarily provide a financial outcome. But it's very, very important from that standpoint, because without the high experience or that expected experience, you have the opportunity to start losing members, or maybe lose a number of people that might be interested otherwise. Now that capital side, if there's not enough money through the capital side, the club will start to show it. Actually, its assets will start to wear down. You'll see it in any number of ways on the golf course, in the clubhouse, and some of the amenities. So there always the club has a voracious appetite for capital. So as we talk about the footprint and maybe even strategic budgeting versus tactical budgeting, we'll discuss what you can learn from your own finances and what it says versus what you do. So the footprint concept of the club, and you think about it, clubs are pretty big footprints, hundreds of acres, if not more. And it's not just the golf course. It's of course the golf course is a huge asset. It takes up over a course of 20 years, maybe 30 or 40% of the money that's going to be necessary to go into capital. But then there's all the other things. But the footprint has funding needs. And I'll get back to that in a second. But just to touch base on operations real quick and then put it to bed here. This slide here is all clubs with golf across North America here. So this isn't just MGA. I will point out a few things as we go through here, what MGA looks like. But this is all clubs with golf. But even if I put the MGA up here, this chart would look almost identical. All right, so you'll notice the blue line there is your operating revenue, operating result, excuse me. And then the gold line is capital generation, all right? So the median of the industry is virtual break even on the operating side, all right? The 75th percentile is plus 4% of operating revenue. So still a very small number when you think about it. And if you look at this slide, you'll say that from the 75th percentile all the way back to the first percentile, that's about 77% of clubs, all clubs, are operating somewhere beneath 4% of operating revenue on the bottom line on the operating side. What's that tell us? Well, it tells us that that's not the financial driver of the club. To reiterate, that's just the vehicle for generating a membership experience. Okay, members actually consume that money year over year, join the club. So when we get that question from someone, we're sitting in a membership meeting and we're talking about the next dues increase or the next capital program we have, there's someone puts their hand up and say, hey, I've been a member of the club for 30 years, I've put in X thousands of dollars, where did that money go? Well, the answer could be about 85% of the money you put into the club is gone the moment that you spend it because you got something for that money. You got the membership experience. And we break even every year on the operating side, so that 85% went to a break-even operation for everybody to enjoy the club. There's no financial result of that. The financial result is on the capital side. That's initiation fees, capital assessments, things of that nature. And you'll see the median here is 18%. Okay, and we've learned that the best clubs, the clubs that are succeeding, are generating more than 20% on that line every year, year over year. And that's 20% of operating revenue. And so as operating revenue goes up, so then should that, so that there's always enough free cash to spend on the experience of the club from the amenity standpoint and to overcome all of the priorities of capital. Principal and interest on debt, obligatory capital, aspirational capital. And if there's anything left, then there's capital reserves. And we always say that obligatory capital comes first, aspirational capital has to be spent the moment that you need it because you're going to generate it, you're going to use it. Because if you don't use it now, guess what? It's not going to go away. It's only going to be more expensive, the following year or years down the road. So we talk about vision, all right? The one thing about the footprint is this, and we've learned that by doing regression analysis a lot, which I'm not going to get into because we could spend just an hour on that alone. And I'm an operator guy. I'm not really the math guy. So, but we have studied this, and we've learned that there's two metrics that can get you pretty close from a discussion standpoint as to where your operating dues ought to be. And we call it the dues predictor. And it's your gross assets and the amenity subsidy that comes from your dues. So at the median, most clubs have a 50% dues subsidy to their amenities. Okay, so that means that 50% of your dues is going towards overhead expenses, and the other 50% is going to cover your golf operation, your food and beverage operation, and your non-golf sports operation. But that's about average, we see. So if your operating dues is $15,000 a year for the top family membership at the club, the amenity for that class, the amenity subsidy is $7,500. And that's pretty consistent across the board when we look at the amenity subsidy at a club. It's about 50% of someone's operating dues. So when we talk about the footprint, we can use those two metrics and put them through a calculation that our mathematicians have developed and statisticians have developed that can accurately predict what your dues line should be. And if that prediction is a lot less than what you're actually collecting, there's a couple of reasons for that. Either you don't have enough members or you're not charging them enough. Because the R squared, or the measurement that we take to say, okay, how accurate is this prediction, is about 92, so it's 92%. Can explain the variance that you have. So that's a real data-based calculation that we would suggest all clubs should look at to just have a discussion about, is our dues right? Because we're very good in this industry about asking, what's your dues increase? What's your dues increase? What's your dues? What's your dues? And the truth of the matter is that the clubs in your neighborhood don't have anything to say about what your dues ought to be. That's competing on price. When you're competing on, when you're looking at it from the needs of your footprint, that's a whole different ballgame. Your club is different than the club next door in terms of size and all of that. You might be a club that has $60 million of assets, and a club down the street might only have $20 million in assets. You might have 800 members. They might have 300. There's a lot of things that go on into that. That's the hard cost. The soft cost of the operating footprint is the members' expectations, right? They have a lot to say about that, all right? And so if you have a membership that's very demanding on quality and the availability of service and things of that nature, that has a dramatic impact on what the operating costs of the club are going to be. And so when you look at the operating costs, the expenses per full member equivalent is usually 2 times your operating dues, okay? So if that same $15,000 a year dues, I guess if the amenity is $7,500, it's half of it, and you've got dues at $15,000, your expenses per full member equivalent are going to be close to $30,000 in that case, in a break-even operation. Because what we've learned over time and over the course of a member lifetime, they're going to spend what they spend in operating dues, because that's mandatory, and then they're going to spend another amount that's pretty equal to that in using the club and accessing the club. And it's very consistent from club type to city to region. It's not just cornered into one area of the world, like Long Island, for instance. It's very consistent. And so from a budget perspective, there's a number of tests that you can do to look at that. And so since the membership experience is so important to strategy, how many discussions does the board having on vision, for instance? This slide here deals with that. Where's the club going to be 5 years, 10 years from now? We suggest that 5 years is probably a good number, 3 years, anywhere from 3 years to 7. We like to settle on 5 because from an aspirational capital standpoint, that's about as far out as you can see, unless you're doing something really large. What services and amenities will we be offering? How will we address that generational diversity we talked about a second ago? Who will our members be? And how do we become an employee of choice, like Mike McConnell were talking about? Very important issues. And so that enduring relevance is going to be more and more and more important and more valid as we consider the number of 37 to 47-year-olds coming into the market over the next 10 to 15 years. So the clubs that are going to really be able to set sail within that are going to be the clubs that are paying attention to the needs and the wants of those upcoming new members, and probably the people that know more about that are the people that joined the club the most recent. So I think we get there. So when we talk about governance and then we talk about budget, we know that, me and about 6 other people in the company spend all of our time beating the pavement, going from club to club to club. And so between the 6 of us, we all probably have conversations with boards and memberships probably 200 to 300 times a year, if not more. We've learned that over time that clubs tend to be mired in operating governance. And we've learned that they spend about 90% of their time in the boardroom in operating governance. Microscope detail on budget versus actual on the operating side. And maybe not spending as much time on the strategic issues, like what's the direction of our compounded annual growth rate of club net worth, which we'll talk about here in a second. But there's a distinct difference between the red bucket clubs and the green bucket clubs, and this slide kind of gets into that a little bit, and focuses more of their efforts from a budgeting standpoint on the balance sheet, really, and then maybe the operating. The other thing that we've learned about this too is that most clubs are exceedingly good at budgeting their operations. And they're good at monitoring it, like I said, and they're very good at meeting those budgets. And so a lot of time goes into it. I know in my experience as a general manager, we would spend sometimes 2.5, 3 months just vetting the operating budget every year and really trying to get as close as we could on that. And sometimes it was for the wrong reasons, sometimes it was for the right reasons, usually a combination between the two. And some of that is to keep dues as low as possible or keep the dues increase as down as possible, whether it needed to be or not, regardless of what the output was from the membership experience, right? But we didn't spend any time, it seemed, on the balance sheet. So strategic budgeting would suggest that you look at the balance sheet and start with a couple of different numbers, which we'll talk about here in a second, and how to back your way through that. And maybe looking at that not just in a 1-year lens, but in a multi-year lens, like a 3-year outlook. And then backing it down so that while you're proceeding with the operations the way you've been, and many of them are just excellent when I look around the room, that there's probably some headroom in putting time and effort into the balance sheet from a budgeting standpoint. So we talked about clubs, and we're going to focus on these 2 items. There's 5 things that we know that are very important for not just boards to know, but every member of the club to know, and maybe even most of the management team. Number 1 is clubs are a high fixed cost business. We talked about that. You know, we've learned too that expenses are not bad. You know, the fact is because those expenses in a break-even operation are going to pretty much flow with whatever your dues rate is. It would seem to us that the only way to really reduce your expenses in any major detail would be to decrease your dues. You know, and so when you're trying to you know, maybe even get a round peg into a square hole sometimes on the expense and revenue sides, that maybe the realization that, look, our expenses are good because we need those expenses to deliver that experience the way our members want them to be done. And if there's any aspect of efficiency that needs to be applied, it's probably not something that you talk about in the boardroom. It's probably something that you talk about in the management team sessions, because there's only about 7% of your total expenses, we've learned, that are actually subject to things like efficiency. And yet efficiency is something that I know a lot of boards talk a lot about. The other highlighted one here is every stakeholder of the club understanding the concepts reflected in what we think is the most important metric, and that is net worth over time. And looked at from the standpoint of the compounded annual growth rate of the club's net assets or member equity, whatever it is that you call that. So the second piece of this is that clubs are a capital intense organization. High fixed costs from the operation side, highly intense on the capital side. This list of industries, it starts with the power generation and delivery industry at 293%. Clubs are just below that at about 283% at the median. Okay, that's pretty, and so if you look at this is the capital intensity ratio of all clubs with golf, you'll see the median right there at 280%. And the 75th percentile is up closer to 300%, if not a little over. Many of the clubs in this room are over 300%. I know that, and it's not unusual to see a capital intensity ratio at a club to be in the 330% range. So what does that mean? Well, that means that you need $3.30 or $3 of capital to generate $1 of annual operating revenue. That's capital intensity, okay? And so the focus on the capital side can't be overemphasized, and yet in our industry it tends to be a lagging focus at many clubs. It's becoming more and more prevalent, but I think over the history, in the last, well, especially since the 08-09 meltdown, that the capital side of clubs has been one of the more weakest aspects of club governance over the years. So there's the capital intensity. So you look at the chart on the left is the operating revenue and total capital income of all clubs with golf. You'll see at the 75th percentile is $14 million of operating revenue. That's annual operating revenue. You can even go by 5 years average annual operating revenue to get to that number. That's how Wall Street would do it. And then you go to gross assets, and you'll see at the 75th percentile about $43 million of assets to serve that $14 million in gross operating revenue. So we're a capital-intense industry. So it really, it's a complicated thing, but it is something that clubs, we believe, have to get their arms around in order to be able to grow the club and look forward, look out over the hood or the horizon a little bit, rather than constantly under the hood. So when you look at that information, everything that we've said so far is, what type of industry do we really manage? I think we've all said that we're kind of in the hospitality industry. If you go around the room, there are folks that say, hey, we're in the dues business. And yeah, that's all true. But when you look at it from a capital intensity standpoint and what the club needs from that standpoint, we're actually in the capital asset management business as boards and as general managers and CFOs. 70% of clubs operate near break even, so there's no financial outcome there. And then on average, 75% of assets, in other words, the cash that flows into member equity, for the most part, 75% of that is being invested in property, plant, and equipment. So as soon as it's generated, it's spent, put into play. And so, your balance sheet is one of the easiest balance sheets to look at. And there's a couple of caveats there, but 90% of your assets are going to fall in two lines: net book value, property and plant, and cash. Now, I'm sure there's a number of clubs in this room, because it happens in this area more than anywhere that I know of. There's clubs that don't depreciate your assets, and among you, there are clubs that don't book your property and plant to gross assets either. All right, maybe it even goes to member equity, maybe it's just written off altogether. In that case, when we're talking about determining the footprint, we've learned and studied a number of data proxies that we can use to do better capital planning in the cases where there's no depreciation line or there's no gross property, plant, and equipment line. And we've tested that a number of times, and we've worked with different partners across the industry to help with that. For instance, we just did a paper, an associate of ours, Dave Duvall, did a paper with the assistance of Sal from Condon O'Meara. And their research, they were working off of a hypothesis to say, how can we use our current depreciation rate to project the future capital needs? And they did a really nifty study on that and came up with what we would call a discussion starter. And that would take your depreciation number for this year and multiply that 20 times to give you a viewpoint or a discussion starter for what your next 10 years of capital needs might be. And we've run some different analysis on that, and it seems that hypothesis might just work out. And so those are interesting ways to put proxies on the whole thing, just to get ideas started about how much money are our members really on the hook for. Because the capital side is really an important piece, especially when you take into account the number of new people that are going to be interested in joining clubs, and what are the clubs doing to attract their interest that might be different than what they're currently doing. So net worth, we look at the one line on the balance sheet, and another thing on this. If you're a club that doesn't depreciate, most likely this isn't going to be a metric that works for you. Just, spoiler, but if you do depreciate assets and you do book the gross property and plant, this will be a good metric for you to look at over time starting by looking back. We went back to 2006 and plotted, the compounded annual growth rate of over 1,000 clubs. What I have on the chart here is an example club on the left. And you see that a nice steady growth, consistent growth over time, with some magnitude to it. And then the chart on the right is a club that maybe for the first 10 years of this was kind of flat. What this means is that their capital income matched, for the most part, their depreciation number. And the chart on the left means that their capital income exceeded their depreciation number by quite a bit. So in a break-even operation, the way to move your net growth, your net worth growth, is through capital income over depreciation. And so it's a good number to track and keep an eye on and to project forward. And I suggest that this is a good number to start a budget with if you keep these metrics in place. So, we'll talk about that right at the end, and I'll just keep flipping through here. Another one to look at and keep in mind, and you can also track this in a budget model, is your net to gross property, plant, and equipment ratio. I know that sounds fancy, but it's quite easy. You have your gross property and plant minus accumulated depreciation equals net property and plant. You do net property plant over, it's under gross property and plant, you get a number between 0 and 100%. Okay, and that number is going to oscillate every year. If it's above 50%, 55%, you probably have a pretty fresh set of assets. If it's down in the below 40%, then you probably have a lot of deferred capital. And in those cases, your depreciation number is probably not realistic either. So there are some things to look at from a budgetary perspective there that can help a club not just steer its operation, but steer its balance sheet in the right direction. If you're one of those buckets, those clubs that's in the red bucket, you can get out of that by looking at things through this lens. If you're a green bucket club, you can use these metrics in this process to stay there and even improve upon it. So best practice in capital budgeting we've learned, and think that the obligatory capital is really a function of capital dues. If you don't already have a capital dues, then some clubs have one dues number and they have a bit that they move over to capital, and the other part that stays. Sometimes it's flexible, sometimes it's a rule. The bottom line, we believe that it's best practice to match your capital dues to your obligatory needs. The question is, what are you using to determine your obligatory needs? Well, we mentioned a couple of things, right? We mentioned that depreciation times 20 to get to the 10-year number, then you can back down to each year. That's going to give you an average. It's really just a discussion starter. Or you can have an evaluation of your assets that's going to be very, very precise. So an asset evaluation with a useful life and its replacement cost moving forward. That's the most accurate way to do it. And then aspirational capital covered by initiation fees and maybe a little bit of debt. Okay, we don't really believe that much in assessments, although we know some clubs that's part of the culture, and that's fine. But assessments would be part of this too. We would suggest too that maybe assessments are best served on the aspirational side, and maybe not in the deferred maintenance side, because if you have a piled up deferred maintenance, that assessment is just catching up for years past with members maybe not contributing what they need while they depleted those assets. I don't even know when we started, so yeah. Wrap up? Okay. All right, so I'm going to flip through some of this and just get to the end here, where to start on this, and just finish it out, and then offer, and some, the opportunity to ask questions. I'll be around the rest of the day as well. But if you're looking at strategic budgeting and you're looking at a balance sheet, let's maybe say you're going to go out 3 years on that. I would start with looking at the growth of net worth. And I would say, okay, what's my projected net assets at the end of the year? I would put a, say, 5% or a 6% number to increase that by. And that's my targeted unrestricted net assets or member equity, whatever it is you call it, shareholders' equity. You already know your capital sources because you've already done a pretty extensive operating budget that's looked ahead and looked at your initiation fees, looked at your capital dues, any assessments that you have. If you have a preservation fund, you pretty much know what that's going to be. So that's a solid number that you can do. And then you're going to go over and look at your capital needs. You know what your debt service is. That's a capital need. You're going to look at your obligatory capital, and that, like I said, is the two ways that we look at it is that depreciation times 20 to get to 10, and then go back from there. Then aspirational needs based on whatever plans that you have that plugged in. And then anything you want to add into reserves. The two boxes on the bottom definitely need to match, or the sources has to be more than the needs. And then they both have to translate to being able to hit that UNA target. All right, so it's a little different way of looking at budget, which brings the balance sheet into the process that you're already doing, and then you're going to have some lively discussions about it because there's probably going to be some gaps And you may even look on the horizon and say, look, 3 years from now, we're going to have a huge gap. How are we going to cover that? You know, and you may not have automatically seen that. I don't know. Some clubs that we work with, they find that. And so that's a good place to start. We're always available to help with it. This is right up our alley. We focus on this because we know it's so strategically important. So to close, I'll say that there's a couple of things that we can do for anybody upon request. Number one would be, let's look at the dues predictor. Are you interested in that? Would you like to see what that calculation looks like for your club? We just need a balance sheet to be able to do that and a little bit of other data, operating data to get that done. And the other thing too is the capital needs can be accurately quantified, all right? We have a program called Compass that does these things and also does the strategic budgeting on the balance sheet side. We believe, after being in it now for a couple of years, and we have about 200 clubs that are in it, we believe it's a very strong program and that most clubs should be at least looking at it and considering it as a tool for continuity, number one, and for number two, to have a precise quantification of those needs going forward. And so we're available to do a dues prediction for you and also a net worth analysis where we'll look at your net worth since 2006 and see what your chart looks like. Is it upward, or is it flat, or is it going down? What's it doing and why is it doing it? And we can have great conversations about that. So with that, I will say thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity. We could do this for hours.